Sophie Laurent's hands trembled as the billionaire CEO announced his million-dollar wager to humiliate her in front of Manhattan's wealthiest diners. The elegant grandmother sobbing at the corner table was about to reveal a 50-year-old secret that would destroy everything the CEO's family had built on lies. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Sometimes the cruelest moments in life arrive wrapped in silk and served on fine china. For Sophie Laurent, a 26-year-old waitress at Le Jardin d'Or, one of Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurants, humiliation was about to be delivered with a side of arrogance she would never forget. She had no way of knowing that the man who would attempt to destroy her dignity in front of a room full of the city's elite would also inadvertently reunite two souls separated by decades of silence, betrayal, and unimaginable wealth. This is not a story about a simple wager or a cruel joke. This is the story of how one man's mockery became the catalyst for uncovering a family's secret so profound it would shake the foundations of one of America's most powerful dynasties, and how a grandmother's tears would wash away 50 years of carefully constructed lies. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Jardin d'Or, casting golden patterns across the pristine white tablecloth. The restaurant occupied the entire top floor of the Ashford Building, a gleaming tower of steel and glass in midtown Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, and the soft murmur of refined conversation mixed with the delicate clink of silverware against porcelain. This was the domain of the ultra-wealthy, where reservations were made months in advance and a single meal could cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sophie moved through the space with practiced grace, her black dress uniform perfectly pressed, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She had worked at Le Jardin d'Or for 3 years, ever since she arrived in New York from Montreal. Her mother Isabelle had raised her alone after her father disappeared before Sophie was born, and she had instilled in Sophie both impeccable French and an unshakable work ethic. The restaurant job was supposed to be temporary, a way to pay the bills while she built her translation business. But the tips were excellent, and the money helped support her mother, who was battling the early stages of dementia back in Canada. Sophie's section tonight included the prized corner table, the one with the best view of Central Park, where the sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. As she checked the reservation list, she saw the name that made the restaurant manager peer, visibly straighten his already perfect posture: Marcus Caldwell. The name alone commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Marcus Caldwell was a legend in the tech world, a self-made billionaire who had built his empire by the age of 35. His company, Caldwell Innovations, had revolutionized cloud computing and artificial intelligence, making him one of the youngest members of the Forbes 100. But his wealth was matched only by his reputation for being ruthless, demanding, and utterly without compassion for those he deemed beneath him. The business magazines called him a visionary. His employees called him a tyrant, and everyone who worked in high-end service knew him as a nightmare customer who seemed to take genuine pleasure in belittling waitstaff. At precisely 7 o'clock, Marcus Caldwell swept into the restaurant flanked by 2 associates, younger men in expensive suits who laughed too loudly at his jokes and nodded eagerly at his every word. He was tall and lean, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Sophie made in 6 months. His dark hair was artfully styled, and his face held the kind of sharp, angular features that photographs well. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a predator who had never known what it meant to be vulnerable. Pierre himself escorted them to the corner table, bowing slightly as he pulled out Marcus's chair. Sophie took a steadying breath and approached with 3 leather-bound menus and a warm smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Le Jardin d'Or. May I start you with something to drink?" Marcus didn't look up from his phone. His fingers danced across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Water. Sparkling. Room temperature. Not cold. Not warm. Room temperature. Do you understand the difference?" His tone was dismissive, as if he were speaking to a child or perhaps a particularly slow-witted pet. Sophie's smile didn't waver. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." She turned to the other men, who ordered wine with apologetic glances in her direction, as if trying to compensate for their boss's rudeness. When she returned with the drinks, Marcus finally looked up, and she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. He studied her the way one might study a specimen under glass, his gaze traveling from her face to her name tag and lingering there. "Sophie." He pronounced it with an exaggerated French accent, drawing out the syllables in a way that somehow made it sound like an insult. "That's quite exotic. You're French?" "Yes, sir. I'm from Montreal. How delightful." His smile was sharp and wholly insincere. "Then perhaps you can help settle a debate we've been having." He gestured to his companions, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. "I've been telling these gentlemen that true French service is a dying art, that even in the best French restaurants in America, you can't find someone who can actually serve a proper meal in flawless French. They disagree. They think you modern transplants are just as good as the real thing." Sophie felt the trap closing, but kept her expression neutral. "I'll be happy to serve you in French if you prefer, sir. Our entire staff is multilingual." "Oh, I'm sure you can speak some French." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his voice rising just enough that nearby tables began to turn their heads. "But can you serve an entire meal from greeting to dessert in perfect, elegant, classical French, the kind they use at Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris? Can you explain every dish, every wine pairing, every subtle flavor note with the sophistication and grace of someone who truly understands French culture? Because I'll be honest, he looked around the room, clearly playing to an audience now. I don't think you can. I think you'll stumble over your words, mix up your grammar, and prove my point exactly. The restaurant had gone quiet. Sophie was aware of every eye in the room turning toward their table. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. I assure you, sir, I'm fully capable of providing excellent service in French or English, whichever you prefer. Marcus laughed, a cold, calculated sound. Here's what I'll do. I'll make this interesting. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen several times before turning it to show her. On the screen was a banking app displaying an account balance that made her heart skip a beat. You see this? $1 million. I'll transfer this to you right now, tonight, if you can serve me an entire meal in perfect French without making a single mistake, not one grammatical error, not one moment of hesitation, not one word of English. He paused, his smile widening. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll admit in front of everyone here that American service can never match true French elegance. You'll admit that you're just a pretender playing dress-up in a language you don't really own. His associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them cleared his throat. Marcus, maybe we should just order. Marcus waved him off without taking his eyes from Sophie. What do you say? Are you confident enough in your heritage to accept my challenge? Or are you going to scurry away and send someone else to take our order? The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just offering money. He was offering humiliation disguised as opportunity. Sophie knew that if she accepted and made even the smallest error, she would become a story Marcus told at cocktail parties, a cautionary tale about knowing one's place. But if she refused, she would look like a coward, and worse, she would validate his prejudices. She was trapped, and he knew it. The room felt impossibly silent. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares, some sympathetic, others simply curious about the spectacle unfolding before them. Her mind raced. She could walk away. She could tell Pierre what was happening and let him handle it. But something deeper than pride was stirring in her chest. It was the voice of her mother who had taught her to never let anyone make her feel small. It was the memory of every condescending comment, every assumption that she was less than because she served food for a living. It was the accumulated weight of every Marcus Caldwell she had ever served. Every man who thought wealth gave him the right to treat others as entertainment. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a silver knife through silk. How utterly predictable. The voice was clear, refined, and carried the unmistakable weight of old money and older authority. Every head in the restaurant turned toward a table near the window, where an elderly woman sat alone. Sophie had noticed her when she arrived, an elegant figure in a cream-colored suit, her white hair styled in soft waves, her posture impeccable despite her apparent age. She had diamonds at her throat and wrists, the kind that whispered rather than shouted their value. But it was her face that held Sophie's attention now, a face that was somehow both serene and absolutely furious. The woman stood slowly, using a delicate cane with a silver handle, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. She was small in stature, but towered with presence as she walked toward Marcus's table. Her movements were deliberate, measured, and Sophie noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, though whether from age or emotion was impossible to tell. "Young man," the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "I have been dining in the finest establishments across 3 continents for longer than you have been alive. I have witnessed extraordinary grace and appalling rudeness in equal measure, but never in all my years have I seen someone transform cruelty into sport quite so efficiently." Marcus's expression shifted from smug confidence to annoyed confusion. I'm sorry, do I know you? You don't." The woman stopped a few feet from his table, and Sophie saw that tears were beginning to form in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "But I know you, Marcus Caldwell. I know your type. I've watched men like you my entire life. Men who believe their wealth grants them permission to humiliate others, to treat human beings as objects of amusement." The tears began to fall now, tracking down her powdered cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. Her voice grew softer, more intimate, and somehow that made it more powerful. 50 years ago, someone made a wager not unlike yours. A powerful man thought it would be entertaining to humiliate a young woman trying to make her way in the world. He mocked her accent, her background, her attempts to serve him with dignity. Sophie's heart was pounding. Something about the woman's words resonated with a frequency she couldn't quite name, like a bell being struck in a distant room. The woman's gaze never left Marcus's face, but now it held something beyond anger. It held grief, deep and ancient and raw. That young woman was serving at a restaurant in Paris. She was 19 years old, trying to support her younger brother, and she believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she was just good enough, she could build a decent life. The man who mocked her was an American businessman, wealthy and arrogant, much like yourself. He made her a similar offer, a sum of money if she could perform some arbitrary task perfectly, knowing she would fail. Her voice broke slightly, and she paused to compose herself. When she did fail, because the task was designed to be impossible, he ensured that everyone in that restaurant knew He made sure she understood that she would never be anything more than a servant, someone to be used and discarded. The silence in Le Jardin d'Or was absolute. Even Marcus seemed frozen, his usual glib confidence deserting him in the face of this unexpected confrontation. What happened to her? Sophie heard herself ask, her own voice barely above a whisper. The woman finally looked away from Marcus, her eyes meeting Sophie's, and in that moment Sophie felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly knocked her backward. The shape of the woman's face, the particular green shade of her eyes, the way her mouth curved even in sadness. It was like looking at her own mother through a window that showed the future. What happened to her, the woman repeated softly, is that she disappeared. She left Paris that very night, abandoned her brother, her life, everything she knew. She came to America, changed her name, and spent the next 50 years trying to forget that she had ever believed the world could be kind. The woman's tears fell freely now, and her hand gripped the silver handle of her cane so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Sophie found herself moving forward without conscious thought, reaching out to steady the elderly woman, who suddenly seemed as fragile as spun glass. As Sophie's hand touched the woman's arm, she felt a jolt pass between them, a recognition that went deeper than sight or sound. The woman looked up at her, really looked at her, and Sophie saw her eyes widen with something that looked like shock, or perhaps hope, or perhaps the terrible convergence of both. Marcus Caldwell, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, appeared genuinely unsettled. He shifted in his seat, his carefully cultivated mask of superiority cracking around the edges. His associates had gone pale, both of them staring at their plates as if wishing they could disappear into the fine china. The other diners watched in fascinated silence, witnessing something that transcended the usual theater of wealth and power. This was raw, unscripted, and painfully real. The elderly woman took a shaky breath, composing herself with visible effort. She straightened her spine, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained some of its earlier steel. I came to this restaurant tonight because it was recommended by a friend. I rarely dine out any. At my age, the world feels too loud, too harsh, but I wanted to remember what it felt like to be in a beautiful space, to taste expertly prepared food, to feel for just a few hours that civilization still had room for grace. She turned her gaze back to Marcus, and now her eyes held something colder than anger, something that looked almost like pity. Instead, I find you a monument to everything that is small and cruel in human nature. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, curled into fists. Look, I don't know who you are or what your problem is, but I was having a private conversation. This doesn't concern you. Everything concerns me, the woman said quietly, when I watch someone attempt to destroy another person's dignity for sport. She glanced at Sophie, and her expression softened. This young woman has done nothing to deserve your contempt. She came to work today, expecting to serve meals and earn her living honestly. She didn't come here to be your entertainment. Sophie felt tears prickling at the corners of her own eyes. No one had ever defended her like this, not in 3 years of dealing with difficult customers, not in all the small humiliations that came with service work in a city that prided itself on hierarchy. She wanted to thank this stranger, this fierce, elegant woman who had appeared like some kind of avenging angel in cream-colored silk. But before she could speak, Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with an unpleasant screech that made several diners wince. "I've had enough of this," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I came here for dinner, not a lecture from some senile old woman with delusions of moral superiority." He threw his napkin on the table and reached for his jacket. "We're leaving." His associates scrambled to follow, clearly relieved to escape the scene. But as Marcus turned to go, the elderly woman spoke again, and this time her voice carried a weight that made him freeze mid-step. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread to every corner. Marcus turned slowly, his face now genuinely angry rather than merely annoyed. "What did you say?" "Your grandfather," the woman repeated, and now her voice was trembling again, not with fear, but with some deep, unresolved emotion. "Jonathan Caldwell. I knew him a very long time ago." The color drained from Marcus's face. Sophie watched the transformation with fascination and growing understanding. Whatever connection existed between this woman and Marcus's family, it was clearly something he had not expected to confront in a Manhattan restaurant on an ordinary Tuesday evening. "You knew my grandfather?" His voice had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "I did," the woman confirmed. She moved with slow, deliberate steps back to her own table and lowered herself carefully into her chair. Sophie followed instinctively, positioning herself nearby as if she were this woman's personal guardian. The elderly woman looked up at Marcus, who remained standing, his associates hovering uncertainly behind him. "Jonathan Caldwell was the American businessman I mentioned, the one who made the wager in Paris all those years ago." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Sophie felt her own breath catch. The pieces were falling into place in a pattern so unlikely, so impossibly perfect, that it felt like fate rather than chance. The woman's voice grew softer, more distant, as if she were speaking from across a vast expanse of time. "I was 19 years old, working at a restaurant called Le Papillon Blanc in the 6th arrondissement. It was 1972, and Paris was still recovering from the upheaval of the previous years. I was desperate for work, desperate to take care of my younger brother. Our parents had died in a car accident the year before, and I was all he had." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the white tablecloth. patterns that perhaps existed only in memory. Your grandfather came in with business associates, much as you did tonight. He was in Paris negotiating some kind of deal, expanding his company into European markets. He was young then, barely 30, but already he carried himself with that particular arrogance that comes from never having been told no. The room was utterly silent now. Even the kitchen staff had quieted, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Sophie found herself leaning forward, desperate to hear every word. The woman continued, her voice steady despite the tears that still tracked slowly down her face. He made me a wager much like yours. If I could recite the entire wine list from memory, in perfect English with proper pronunciation of every chateau and vintage, he would give me enough money to open my own restaurant. She smiled bitterly. It was a cruel joke, of course. I had been working there only 2 weeks. I hadn't memorized the wine list yet, and my English was adequate, but far from perfect. He knew I would fail. The entertainment wasn't in the possibility that I might succeed. It was in watching me try and fall short in front of all those wealthy diners who saw me as nothing more than a servant. Marcus had gone very still. His face was unreadable, but Sophie could see a muscle working in his jaw. "What happened?" he asked quietly, and for the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, his voice held no trace of mockery or superiority. It was a genuine question, human in its simple curiosity. "I tried," the woman said simply. "I stood there in front of their table and I tried to recite that impossible list. I made it perhaps halfway through before I faltered, confused a vintage, mispronounced a name." Your grandfather laughed. His friends laughed. The other diners looked away, embarrassed on my behalf but not willing to intervene, and when I began to cry, he made it worse. He told me I should be grateful he was teaching me a valuable lesson about knowing my place in the world. She looked directly at Marcus, her green eyes burning with the memory of that long-ago humiliation. "I left that night with barely the clothes on my back. I was so ashamed, so broken, that I couldn't face my brother. I couldn't explain to him why I had lost another job, why we had no money, why I was a failure, so I ran. I used what little savings I had to buy a ticket to New York. I told myself I would send for him once I was established, once I had made something of myself." She wiped at her tears with a trembling hand. "I never saw him again. By the time I had the courage to go back to find him, he had disappeared. No forwarding address, no trace. I spent years searching, hired investigators, followed every lead. Nothing. It was as if he had vanished from the earth." The weight of her grief filled the restaurant, and Sophie felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. She thought of her own mother, Isabel, who had raised her alone in Montreal, who had never spoken of Sophie's father or of any other family. Isabel, who sometimes woke from dreams calling out a name Sophie couldn't quite make out. Isabel, who kept a small, faded photograph of a young man hidden in her jewelry box. A photograph she thought Sophie had never found. The elderly woman's voice broke through Sophie's thoughts. "His name was Thomas, my baby brother. He was 16 when I left him. I've spent 50 years wondering what became of him, whether he hated me, whether he understood that I didn't abandon him out of cruelty but out of shame." She looked at Marcus with devastating honesty. "Your grandfather's casual cruelty didn't just hurt me, Mr. Caldwell. It shattered a family. It created a wound that has never healed. And tonight, watching you prepare to inflict the same pain on this young woman, I simply couldn't bear to witness history repeat itself." Marcus stood frozen, his face a complicated landscape of emotions. Sophie could see the calculations running behind his eyes, a reassessment of a family legend he had perhaps heard in different terms. How many times had he been told about his grandfather's business acumen, his fearlessness in negotiations, his ability to dominate any room he entered? How many of those stories were really just sanitized versions of moments like the one this woman described? Pierre, the restaurant manager, appeared at Sophie's elbow, his face pale with the kind of professional anxiety that comes from watching one's establishment become the stage for an emotional drama that could destroy its reputation. His voice was low and urgent, directed at Sophie, but loud enough for the elderly woman to hear. "Mademoiselle Laurent, perhaps we should allow our guests some privacy. I can take over your tables for the remainder of the evening." "No," the elderly woman's voice cut through his diplomatic suggestion like a blade through butter. She didn't raise her volume, but there was such authority in that single syllable that Pierre actually took a step backward. "This young woman stays. If anyone should leave, it should be me. I've said what I came to say." She gathered her purse, a simple but clearly expensive leather clutch, and began to rise from her chair. Sophie moved without thinking, her hand gently touching the woman's shoulder. "Please don't go." The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place of instinct rather than reason. "There's more to this story. I can feel it. You didn't come here just to confront a rude customer. This is about something else, something bigger." The elderly woman looked up at Sophie, and in her eyes was a mixture of surprise and recognition, as if Sophie had just articulated something she herself had not fully understood. "You're perceptive." She settled back into her chair with a soft sigh. "Perhaps too perceptive for your own good. That's usually a dangerous quality in this world." But she made no further move to leave. and Sophie felt a small surge of relief that surprised her with its intensity. Marcus had been standing in silence, his associates shifting uncomfortably behind him. Now he moved slowly back to his table and sat down, but the aggressive confidence that had defined his earlier presence was gone. He looked younger somehow, less certain, as if the foundations of his self-image had developed sudden cracks. My grandfather never mentioned Paris. His voice was quiet, almost reflective. He talked about building the business, about his innovations in manufacturing, about the deals he made and the competitors he outmaneuvered, but he never talked about Paris. Of course he didn't, the elderly woman said with tired resignation. Men like your grandfather rarely talk about the casualties of their ambition. They construct narratives in which they are always the heroes, always justified, always righteous in their ruthlessness. The people they hurt become invisible, footnotes that don't merit inclusion in the official history. Sophie pulled out the chair across from the elderly woman and sat down, her duties as a waitress momentarily forgotten in the face of this unfolding revelation. Pierre made a small sound of protest, but a single glance from Sophie silenced him. She had spent 3 years being the perfect, invisible server, and in this moment, she simply didn't care about protocol. What was your name? Sophie asked gently. Before you came to America, what did people call you? The woman hesitated, and Sophie could see the internal struggle playing across her face. It had been 50 years since she had spoken that name aloud. 50 years of being someone else, bearing the girl she had been beneath layers of reinvention and carefully constructed identity. My name, she said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from some deep, locked place, was Marguerite Beaumont. In Paris, everyone called me Maggie. It was my brother Thomas who started it. He said Marguerite was too formal, too grown up for someone who still laughed at his terrible jokes. Maggie. Sophie repeated the name, tasting it on her tongue, and felt something shift in her chest. A recognition she couldn't quite name. The woman, Maggie, continued speaking, her voice gaining strength as she gave life to memories that had been locked away for decades. Thomas was brilliant. He wanted to be a writer, a journalist. He had notebooks filled with observations about the world, about people. He saw things others missed. After our parents died, he would read me his stories at night to help me sleep, to keep the grief at bay. Her voice broke. I left all of that behind. I left him behind, and I have never forgiven myself. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. I don't understand. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you try to find him right away? The question was genuine, without judgment, and Sophie found herself revising her opinion of him. Perhaps underneath the layers of privilege and entitlement was someone capable of empathy, someone who had simply never been forced to exercise that particular muscle. Maggie laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. You don't understand shame, Mr. Caldwell. Real shame, the kind that makes you feel like you're contaminated, unworthy of love or connection. Your grandfather didn't just humiliate me in front of strangers. He made me believe I was fundamentally inadequate, that my failure was proof of some essential unworthiness. She pressed her fingers to her temples, as if trying to contain memories that threatened to overflow. I spent months in New York living in a tiny room in a boarding house, working 3 jobs, none of them legal because I had no proper papers. I was terrified and alone and convinced that I had nothing to offer Thomas, that I would only drag him down with my failure. By the time I finally had saved enough money to go back, by the time I had gained enough distance from that terrible night to see it clearly, more than 2 years had passed. I went back to our apartment in Paris, and it was occupied by strangers. The landlord said Thomas had moved out months earlier, left no forwarding address. I searched everywhere. The restaurants where we used to eat, the bookshops he loved, the parks where he would sit and write, nothing. It was as if he had been erased. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face. The story was devastating in its simplicity, in the way a single moment of cruelty had rippled outward to destroy lives and sever connections that should have been unbreakable. And you've been looking for him ever since? All these years? Not continuously, Maggie admitted. There were periods when I gave up, when I convinced myself he had moved on and built a good life without me, that perhaps my absence had been the best thing for him. She smiled sadly. I married, had a good life for a while. My husband died 10 years ago. We never had children. I think perhaps I didn't feel I deserved that happiness, not when I had abandoned Thomas. She looked at Sophie with sudden intensity, but I never stopped wondering. Every time I saw a man of the right age, I would look for Thomas in his face. Every time I heard a French accent, my heart would leap. Hope is a persistent thing, even when it's foolish. The restaurant had begun to stir back to life around them. Other diners were quietly resuming their conversations, though Sophie could feel the weight of their surreptitious glances. This was a story that would be retold at dinner parties across Manhattan for weeks to come. But in their small bubble, the world had narrowed to just the 4 of them. Maggie with her decades of grief, Marcus grappling with an uncomfortable truth about his family legacy, Sophie caught in the middle, and some invisible connection pulling them all together. Marcus cleared his throat. His associates had quietly slipped away at some point, reading the room well enough to know their presence was no longer needed or wanted. Miss Beaumont, I owe you an apology, more than an apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable. His words came slowly, as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. I've spent my entire life believing that success justified any means, that power was its own moral authority. I see now that I was just repeating patterns, following a blueprint laid out by men like my grandfather without ever questioning whether it was right. It's easy to apologize, Maggie said quietly, but her tone wasn't harsh. The question is what you do with this knowledge. Do you change? Do you use your power differently? Or do you just feel briefly guilty and then return to the same patterns because they're comfortable and profitable? Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the challenge implicit in her words. You're right. Words are cheap. He pulled out his phone and Sophie tensed, wondering if he was about to revert to type, to hide behind technology and transactions. But instead, he began typing with focused intensity. When he looked up, his expression was serious. I'm transferring $1 million to a foundation for hospitality workers. People like Sophie who deal with people like me every day. It's not enough, and it doesn't undo anything. But it's a start. Maggie studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. It's a start, she agreed. Sophie sat in silence, overwhelmed by the speed at which the evening had transformed. An hour ago, she had been worried about making rent and getting through another shift. Now she was sitting at the center of a drama that spanned 50 years and connected 3 strangers through threads of pain and redemption. But there was something else nagging at her, a question that had been forming in the back of her mind since Maggie first mentioned her brother's name, Thomas. The name echoed in her memory, connecting to whispered conversations she had overheard as a child, to her mother's mysterious past, to the photograph hidden in the jewelry box. Sophie's hands were trembling. She clasped them together in her lap, trying to still the sudden rushing of her pulse. The coincidences were too many, too specific, stacking up like cards in a house that was either about to reveal something miraculous or collapse into meaningless chance. She looked at Maggie, really looked at her, and saw again those familiar features. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the particular way she tilted her head when listening intently. It was like looking at her own mother's face aged forward 30 years. Ms. Beaumont, Sophie began, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. Your brother Thomas, what did he look like? It was an odd question, she knew, intrusive and specific, but she had to ask. She had to know if the pieces clicking together in her mind had any basis in reality or if she was just desperate to find connection in a lonely city. Maggie's expression softened at the mention of her brother. She reached into her clutch and withdrew a slim leather wallet, the kind that had clearly been expensive once but now showed signs of age and constant handling. From one of its compartments, she pulled out a photograph so worn that the edges had gone soft. She held it for a moment, her thumb caressing the surface with obvious affection, before extending it towards Sophie. This was taken just a few months before I left. He was 16. Almost 17. Sophie took the photograph with careful hand, aware that she was holding something precious, something that had been treasured for 5 decades. The image showed a young man with dark curly hair and striking green eyes, the same shade as Maggie's. He was laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, his face alive with joy and intelligence. He was lean and lanky in the way of teenage boys still growing into their frames, dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, standing in front of what looked like a Parisian cafe. Sophie's heart stopped. She knew this photograph. Not this exact one, but another one, taken perhaps minutes later from a different angle. That photograph lived in her mother's jewelry box, hidden beneath strings of modest pearls and the simple gold cross Isabel wore to church. Sophie had found it when she was 12, snooping as children, and when she'd asked her mother about it, Isabel had gone pale and said only that it was someone from a long time ago, someone had hurt too much to remember. Sophie had never asked again. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sophie looked up from the photograph to find Maggie watching her with an expression that suggested she had seen Sophie's recognition, had witnessed the shock of realization spreading across her face. Where was this taken? Sophie managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. Caf de Flore, Maggie said softly. In the 6th arrondissement. Thomas loved that cafe. He said it was where Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir used to write, and he liked to sit at the same tables and imagine part of that legacy. She smiled at the memory. He was so earnest about everything, so passionate about ideas and justice and truth. I used to tease him about being too serious, but secretly I loved that about him. In a world that seemed increasingly cynical, he remained determinedly hopeful. Sophie set the photograph down on the table with trembling hands. She needed to think, to process. But her mind was racing too fast for coherent thought. The connections were too impossible to ignore. A French brother and sister separated in Paris in 1972. A photograph from Caf de Flore. A woman in Montreal who had raised Sophie alone, who had always been vague about her past, who had sometimes called out in her sleep in French. Words Sophie couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like apologies and pleas for forgiveness. My mother, Sophie said, and the words felt like they were being pulled from somewhere deep inside her, came from Paris. She raised me alone in Montreal. She never talked about her family, never explained why we had no relatives, no connection to anyone from before I was born. Whenever I asked, she would get this look on her face, this terrible sadness, and she would say that some stories were too painful to tell. The air in the restaurant had gone still again. Marcus was watching them both with an expression of dawning understanding, as if he were witnessing something profound and irrevocable unfolding before his eyes. Pierre had stopped even pretending to manage his other tables and stood frozen near the kitchen door, his professional discretion warring with his human curiosity. "What is your mother's name?" Maggie asked, and Sophie could hear the hope and fear braided together in her voice, could see the way her hands had begun to shake, mirroring Sophie's own trembling. Isabel Laurent. But Laurent Laurent was her married name. She took my father's name even though Sophie paused, suddenly seeing the gaps in the story she'd been told her entire life. Even though she always said he left before I was born, she said he was French-Canadian, that it was a brief relationship, that she didn't like to talk about it because it brought back painful memories. Did she ever mention another name? Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper now. A name she used before Laurent? Sophie shook her head, frustrated by the holes in her own family history. She never said. I don't even have a birth certificate with her maiden name on it. She told me it was lost in a fire, that all her documents from before she came to Canada were destroyed. I never questioned it. I just accepted that my mother came from Paris and that her past was too painful to discuss. Maggie closed her eyes and tears began to leak from beneath her lids. When she opened them again, they were bright with a desperate, fragile hope. Isabel was Thomas's middle name, our mother's name. If he had a daughter, if he wanted to honor our mother but also hide from his past from me, he might have chosen that. It would be like him, sentimental and symbolic, even in his attempted anonymity. The implications were staggering. Sophie felt dizzy with the possibility that this elegant, grieving woman sitting across from her might be her grandmother, that the brother Maggie had searched for might have been Sophie's father, that the separation and loss that had defined Maggie's life might have echoed forward into Sophie's own existence. But it was too much, too fast, too extraordinary to simply accept without proof. We need to be certain, Sophie said, trying to inject some rationality into the emotionally charged moment. We can't just assume based on coincidences and feeling. There must be some way to verify this, to know for sure. Marcus, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly leaned forward. DNA test. It's simple, relatively quick, and definitive. If you're related, if Miss Beaumont is your grandmother, the test will show it without any doubt. His voice was practical, grounded, and Sophie felt a flash of gratitude for his presence, for someone who could think logically when she felt like she was drowning in emotion. Maggie nodded slowly. Yes, of course. That's sensible. She looked at Sophie with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. But even if the test confirms it, even if you are Thomas's daughter, I need you to understand something. I need you to know that I never stopped looking for him, that my absence was never about not loving him enough. It was about shame and fear, and 1,000 wrong decisions made in the wake of a single terrible night. Sophie reached across the table and took Maggie's hand, the skin soft and papery beneath her fingers. If you're my grandmother, if Thomas was my father, then you need to know something too. My mother, she has dementia. It's early stages, but it's progressing. She gets confused, loses track of time and place. Sometimes she talks about Paris, about someone she left behind, someone she failed. She cries and I don't know how to comfort her because I don't understand what she's mourning. The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her free hand went to her chest and she made a small sound of pain. Thomas's daughter, she whispered. All these years I had a granddaughter and I never knew. And now when I've finally found you, found him through you, where is he? Is Thomas still alive? Sophie felt tears streaming down her face. She hadn't cried this much in years, hadn't allowed herself to be this vulnerable in public, but nothing about this night followed normal. My mother never talked about my father in the present tense. She always spoke about him as if he were gone. When I was little and asked why I didn't have a daddy like other children, she would say that he was watching over us from somewhere far away. I always assumed she meant he was dead, that he died before I was born or shortly after. Maggie's tears fell freely now, her composure completely shattered. So I lost him twice. Once when I abandoned him in Paris, and again when he died without ever knowing. I spent my whole life trying to find him. The grief in her voice was raw and ancient, the accumulation of 50 years of guilt and longing finally finding voice. But something in Sophie's memory snagged on Maggie's words. The way her mother spoke about her father, careful ambiguity of the phrasing, somewhere far away. Not heaven, not the afterlife, just somewhere far away. And there was something else. Something Sophie had forgotten until this moment. A fragment of conversation she'd overheard when she was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Her mother had been on the phone speaking in rapid French to someone Sophie never identified, and she had said something about it being safer this way, about protecting someone from the past that wanted to find them. Wait, Sophie said suddenly, her voice cutting through Maggie's grief. I don't know for certain that he's dead. I assumed it, but my mother never actually said those words. She was always vague, always speaking in metaphors and half-truths. What if he's alive? What if he's been hiding? Or what if my mother was hiding him from something? Maggie looked up sharply, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. Why would they hide? What would Thomas need to hide from? He was just a boy, just a writer with dreams. He never did anything wrong. The defensive love in her voice was touching. The eternal protectiveness of an older sister even after half a century of separation. Marcus, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened in his chair. His expression had shifted from passive observer to active analyst, the sharp business mind that had built his empire now turning toward this puzzle. Miss Beaumont, after you left Paris after Thomas disappeared, did anything else happen? Any other incidents connected to your family or your situation? Maggie frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. I don't know. I wasn't there. I spent years trying to trace his movements and I found fragments but never enough to build a complete picture. The landlord said Thomas had become withdrawn after I left, that he stopped going to school, stopped seeing his friends. Then one day, about 6 months after I disappeared, someone came looking for him. A well-dressed American man asking questions about where Thomas had gone. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. An American man? What kind of questions? The landlord didn't remember specifics, just that the man seemed very intent on finding Thomas, that he offered money for information. The landlord didn't have anything to tell him. Maggie's voice grew quieter. I always wondered if it was someone your grandfather sent. Mr. Caldwell. If perhaps Jonathan Caldwell felt guilty about what had happened and was trying to make amends, trying to help Thomas as a way of assuaging his conscience. Marcus's expression had gone very still, very serious. That's one possibility. But there's another. My grandfather was many things, but guilty and conscience-stricken were not among. If he sent someone to find Thomas, it wouldn't have been out of kindness. He paused, clearly wrestling with some internal decision about how much to reveal, how much family ugliness to expose. My grandfather's company was built on more than just innovation and hard work. There were rumors, things my father would never speak about directly, about corporate espionage, about silencing competitors, about making problems disappear. The words hung in the air like a gathering storm. Sophie felt pieces clicking into place, a picture forming that was darker and more complicated than she had imagined. If someone was looking for Thomas, if he felt threatened enough to disappear completely, to cut all ties to his past, then maybe her mother's vagueness wasn't just about pain. Maybe it was about protection. Thomas was a writer, Sophie said slowly, thinking out loud. A journalist in training. What if he saw something? What if he knew something about what happened to his sister, about Jonathan Caldwell, and he wanted to expose it? What if he was going to write about it? Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, he would have. That's exactly what Thomas would have done. He was so righteously angry about injustice. If he thought I had been wronged, if he discovered what your grandfather had done, she looked at Marcus, he would have wanted the world to know. He would have seen it as his duty as a journalist to tell the truth. So he became a threat, Marcus said quietly. A young French journalist who could publish an unflattering story about an American businessman expanding into European markets. In 1972, that kind of negative publicity could have derailed deal, damaged reputation, cost millions. His voice was flat, emotional, but Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled into fists. My grandfather would have seen him as a problem that needed to be solved. But Thomas disappeared before anything could be published, Maggie protested. I searched for any articles, any pieces he might have written. There was nothing. If he was planning to expose Jonathan Caldwell, he never got the chance. Or he was stopped before he could, Sophie said. Or someone made it very clear that publishing such a story would have consequences he wasn't willing to risk. She thought of her mother's careful life in Montreal, the way Isabelle had always been cautious about sharing personal information, about forming deep connections with neighbors or co-workers, the way she had taught Sophie to be careful, to keep certain things private, to understand that not everyone needed to know everything about their lives. She had always attributed it to her mother's general anxiety, but now she saw it differently. Not anxiety born of nothing, but a learned awareness born of real fear. We need to talk to your mother, Maggie said urgently. If she's Isabelle, if she's Thomas's daughter, then she must know something. She must understand why he disappeared, where he went, whether he's still alive. Her voice cracked on the last words, the hope too fragile to fully embrace but impossible to extinguish. She's in Montreal, Sophie said, in a care facility. She needs round-the-clock monitoring now because of the dementia. I can't afford to bring her here, and she's not well enough to travel, I see, Lee. The guilt that had been Sophie's constant companion for the past year intensified. She had left Montreal to find better work in New York, to escape the sadness of watching her vibrant, intelligent mother slowly forget herself. She sent money back for Isabelle's care, called every few days, but it never felt like enough. Then we go to Montreal, Marcus said decisively. He pulled out his phone again, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. I'll arrange a private plane. We can leave first thing tomorrow morning. If Miss Laurent can answer these questions, if she can give us the truth about what happened to Thomas, then we need to hear it as soon as possible. He looked up, meeting Sophie's startled gaze. If I played even a small part in bringing you two together, if my terrible behavior tonight somehow led to this, then I want to see it through. I want to help make this right. Sophie stared at him. This man who hours ago had seemed like the embodiment of everything wrong with wealth and privilege, and saw something different now. Beneath the arrogance and the cruelty was someone who had been shaped by toxic family legacy, someone who had never questioned whether the path laid out for him was the right one. His grandfather's sins had echoed forward into Marcus's own behavior, creating a cycle that tonight had finally been interrupted. I can't accept that, Sophie said quietly. A private plane flying us to Montreal, it's too much. You don't owe us that. But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. She did want to go to Montreal. She did want to bring her mother and Maggie together to solve this mystery that had suddenly become the center of her existence. Pride warred with practicality, and practicality was winning. It's not about owing, Marcus said. It's about doing what's right. Maybe for the first time in my life, I have the chance to use my resources for something that actually matters, something that isn't about profit margins or market dominance. Let me do this. Let me be part of putting back together what my grandfather helped tear apart. Maggie reached across the table and placed her hand over Marcus's, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that Sophie felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Your grandfather made a choice 50 years ago that caused immeasurable pain. But you are not your grandfather, Mr. Caldwell. The fact that you're sitting here, that you're willing to help, that you're questioning the legacy you inherited. That alone is redemption of a sort. She squeezed his hand gently. I accept your offer. Not as restitution for old sins, but as a kindness freely given. Thank you. The restaurant around them had finally returned to normal operations, though Sophie was aware of the surreptitious glances still being thrown their way, the whispered conversations at other tables. This night would become legend in Manhattan's social circles. The night Marcus Caldwell was publicly dressed down by an elderly woman and emerged somehow transformed. Pierre approached their table with cautious steps, as if approaching a wild animal that might spook its sudden movement. Mademoiselle Laurent, he said in a low voice, I think perhaps it would be best if you took the remainder of the evening off. These are extraordinary circumstances. Sophie nodded, grateful for his understanding despite the fact that her abrupt abandonment of her duties would leave him short-staffed. She stood and untied her apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the chair. I'll collect my things and be right back. In the small staff room behind the kitchen, Sophie leaned against the cool metal of her locker and tried to process everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. This morning she had woken up worried about making rent and whether her mother had remembered to eat breakfast at the care facility. Now she was preparing to fly on a private plane to Montreal with a billionaire and a woman who might be her grandmother, to confront her mother with questions about a past Isabel had spent Sophie's entire lifetime trying to bury. The whiplash was dizzying. She pulled out her phone and dialed the care facility, asking to be transferred to her mother's room. The phone rang 4 times before Isabel's voice, thin and confused, answered. Hello? Who is this? The fact that her mother didn't recognize her own daughter's number was a knife to Sophie's heart, but she kept her voice bright and steady. Hi, Mom. It's Sophie. I'm calling to check on you. How are you feeling tonight? There was a pause, the sound of rustling fabric, and then Isabel's voice came back slightly stronger. Sophie, yes. I know, Sophie. You're my daughter. You're in New York doing important things. The pride in her voice was evident even through the confusion, and Sophie had to swallow hard against the lump forming in her throat. That's right, Mom. Listen, I'm gonna come visit you tomorrow. I'm bringing some people with me. It's very important. We need to talk to you about some things from a long time ago, from before I was born. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Sophie thought the line had gone dead. Mom, are you still there? When Isabel spoke again, her voice had changed. The confusion was gone, replaced by something sharp and fearful. What people? What do you want to know? Who have you been talking to? The sudden clarity was startling, as if the mention of the past had cut through the fog of dementia and reached something deeper, some part of Isabel that remained fiercely protective even as her mind deteriorated. Mom, it's okay. These are good people. One of them's a woman named Marguerite Beaumont. She said she had a brother named Thomas. The gasp on the other end of the line was audible, followed by a sob that made Sophie's chest constrict. Mom, please. I need to understand. Was Thomas my father? Is Marguerite your aunt? You shouldn't have found her, Isabel whispered, her voice breaking. I kept you safe all these years. I kept us hidden. Why couldn't you just let the past stay buried? The fear in her mother's voice was palpable, and Sophie realized that whatever had driven Thomas and Isabel into hiding, whatever threat had forced them to build new lives under new names, her mother still believed it was real and present. Mom, listen to me. It's going to be okay. We just want to understand what happened. We want to know the truth. There was a long silence, and when Isabel spoke again, her voice was distant, as if she were speaking to herself rather than to Sophie. He made me promise, made me swear I would never tell anyone, never go back, never contact her. He said they would find us if we did. He said powerful men don't forget, and they don't forgive, but he's gone now. He's been gone for so long. Does it even matter anymore? Who is gone, Mom? Is my father gone? Is Thomas dead? Sophie's hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone. The question hung in the air, and she could hear her mother's labored breathing on the other end of the line. Could imagine her struggling with the decision of whether to finally tell the truth after decades of carefully maintained lies. Come tomorrow, Isabel said finally, her voice resigned. Bring Marguerite. If she's really still alive, if she really spent all these years looking for us, then perhaps it's time. Perhaps the secrets have festered long enough. But Sophie, you need to prepare yourself. The story isn't what you think. It's not a simple tale of separation and loss. It's darker than that. More complicated. There are reasons we hid. Good reasons. And those reasons didn't die just because time passed. The line went dead, and Sophie stood in the small staff room staring at her phone, her mother's cryptic warnings echoing in her mind. She gathered her belongings in a daze, changed out of her work uniform into jeans and a sweater, and returned to the dining room where Maggie and Marcus were waiting. They had moved to a quieter corner booth, and someone had brought them coffee. Maggie looked up as Sophie approached, and the hope and fear mingled in her expression was almost painful to witness. I spoke to my mother, Sophie said, sliding into the booth beside Maggie. She knows who you are. When I mentioned your name and Thomas, she broke down. She's expecting us tomorrow. The relief that washed over Maggie's face was immediately complicated by apprehension. She's alive. Isabel is alive, and she knows about me. After all these years, Thomas told his daughter about me. The wonder in her voice suggested she had never truly believed that Thomas had remembered her with anything other than anger and betrayal. She's scared, though, Sophie continued. She kept talking about promises and powerful men and staying hidden. She said the story is darker and more complicated than than we think. Marcus and Maggie exchanged a glance, and Sophie saw understanding pass between them. Whatever Jonathan Caldwell had done, whatever threat he had represented, it had been serious enough to keep two people in hiding for decades. Serious enough that even now, even with dementia eroding her memory, Isabel's first instinct was fear. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a quick call, his voice low and businesslike as he arranged the flight details for the following morning. When he hung up, he looked at both women with an expression that was equal parts determination and guilt. Whatever we find out tomorrow, whatever we learn about what my grandfather did, I want you both to know that I will do everything in my power to make it right. If there are still threats, I'll eliminate them. If there are wrongs that can be corrected, I'll correct them. My family created this mess, and I'll be damned if I don't help clean it up. The three of them sat in the quiet restaurant as the evening drew toward closing time. Bound together by threads of history they were only beginning to untangle. Sophie thought about the photograph in her mother's jewelry box, about the young man with the green eyes and the hopeful smile, about all the questions she had never asked because she had been taught that some doors were meant to stay closed. Tomorrow those doors would be thrown open, and whatever lay behind them would reshape not just her understanding of her own past, but potentially her entire future. Maggie reached out and took Sophie's hand, and the gesture was so natural, so instinctively grandmother-like, that Sophie felt a fresh wave of emotion threaten to overwhelm her. We'll face it together, Maggie said softly. Whatever the truth is, whatever your mother reveals, we'll face it as family, because that's what we are, Sophie. I can feel it in my bones. You're my granddaughter, and I've been searching for you without even knowing you existed. The private plane waiting at Teterboro Airport the next morning was unlike anything Sophie had ever experienced. She had flown commercial a handful of times. Cramped middle seats on budget airlines where every amenity cost extra and comfort was a luxury no one could afford. This was a different universe entirely. The aircraft was small but exquisitely appointed, with leather seats that looked more like armchairs, polished wood accents, and a crew that greeted them as if they were visiting dignitaries rather than passengers. Maggie settled into her seat with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to such luxuries, though Sophie noticed the older woman's hands trembling slightly as she fastened her seatbelt. Marcus had arrived at the airport dressed more casually than Sophie had seen him, in dark jeans and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked younger this way, less like the intimidating billionaire from the restaurant and more like someone who might actually be capable of human connection. He had brought his laptop and a slim leather portfolio, and Sophie suspected he was the kind of person who couldn't stop working even in the midst of a personal crisis. But there was a softness to his expression now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before, as if the events of the previous evening had cracked something open inside him that had been sealed shut for years. As the plane lifted into the gray morning sky, Sophie stared out the window at Manhattan shrinking below them, the grid of streets and towers becoming abstract patterns of light and shadow. She had left Montreal 3 years ago with a single suitcase and a desperate hope that New York would offer something better, some escape from the sadness of watching her mother deteriorate. Now she was returning with a billionaire and a woman who might be her grandmother, chasing answers to questions she hadn't known to ask until 12 hours ago. The symmetry felt significant somehow, as if her life had been building toward this moment all along. "Did you sleep at all last night?" Marcus asked, looking up from his laptop. His voice was gentle, concerned, and Sophie was struck again by how different he seemed from the man who had tried to humiliate her in front of a restaurant full of strangers. She shook her head, knowing the dark circles under her eyes told the story clearly enough. "Every time I closed my eyes, I just kept thinking about everything we might learn today, about who my father was, what he was running from, whether he's really gone or if there's some impossible chance he's still alive somewhere." Maggie, who had been staring out her own window in silence, turned at this. "I've played out this reunion in my mind 1,000 times over the years. In my fantasies, I would find Thomas and he would forgive me immediately, understand why I ran, and we would pick up as if no time had passed at all." She smiled sadly. "But I'm not a fool. I know that 50 years of separation can't be erased with an explanation and an apology. If he's alive, he's a 70-year-old man I don't know, and if he's dead, then I've lost my chance to ever make things right. He told his daughter about you," Sophie pointed out. "My mother knew your name, knew who you were. That means he didn't forget you, didn't cut you out of his story completely. Whatever else happened, he made sure I would know I had an aunt named Marguerite. That has to mean something." "Or he told her as a warning," Maggie said quietly. "A cautionary tale about abandonment and broken promises. We don't know the context. We don't know if he spoke my name with love or with bitterness." The vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. This wealthy, elegant woman who had spent half a century tormented by guilt and uncertainty, about to face the consequences of a decision made when she was barely older than a child herself. The flight to Montreal took just over an hour, and Sophie spent most of it in a state of anxious anticipation that made her stomach churn. She couldn't eat the pastries the flight attendant offered, couldn't focus on the magazine she had picked up. Instead, she found herself studying Maggie's face, looking for traces of her own features, markers of genetic connection that would confirm what she felt in her bones to be true. The shape of the nose was similar, the particular arch of the eyebrows, the way Maggie's mouth curved when she smiled. It was like looking at a map of her own face aged forward by decades. A car was waiting for them at the airport. another luxury that Marcus had arranged with the same casual efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. The driver navigated the familiar streets of Montreal, and Sophie felt a complicated mix of emotions as they passed landmarks she knew. The bagel shop where she used to get breakfast, the park where her mother used to take her to feed the ducks when Sophie was small and Isabel's mind was still sharp and clear. Everything looked the same, but Sophie felt fundamentally altered, as if she had become a different person in the space of a single night. The care facility where Isabel lived was a pleasant enough place as such institutions went. It was clean and well-staffed, with gardens that would be beautiful in summer and common rooms where residents could socialize or watch television. Sophie visited as often as she could, though never as often as guilt told her she should, and she knew the facility's layout by heart. The receptionist recognized her and smiled, then looked with curiosity at Sophie's well-dressed companion. Sophie signed them in as visitors, and they made their way down the quiet hallway toward her mother's room. Outside the door, Sophie paused, her hand on the handle, suddenly paralyzed by the magnitude of what they were about to do. "We're about to change everything," she said quietly. "Once we walk through this door, once we ask these questions and hear these answers, we can't unknow what we learn. Are we ready for that?" "No," Maggie said honestly, "but we're doing it anyway, because the not knowing has been worse than any truth could be." She reached out and squeezed Sophie's shoulder. "Whatever we find on the other side of that door, we face it together." Sophie nodded, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. Isabelle Laurent sat in the chair by the window, backlit by the pale winter sunlight streaming through the glass. She was dressed in a soft blue cardigan and gray slacks, her silver hair neatly brushed. For a moment she looked almost like her old self, the mother Sophie remembered from childhood before the disease had begun stealing her away piece by piece. But as Sophie stepped into the room and Isabel turned to face them, Sophie saw that her mother had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her hands twisted together in her lap with anxious energy. Sophie moved to her mother's side immediately, kneeling down beside the chair and taking those restless hands in her own. "Mom, I'm here. I brought Marguerite, just like I said I would." Isabel's gaze moved past Sophie to where Maggie stood frozen in the doorway, and Sophie watched as recognition and disbelief and joy and terror all chased across her mother's face in rapid succession. "Maggie," Isabel whispered, and her voice was that of a much younger woman, clear and strong and full of wonder. "Oh my God, Maggie, you're alive. You're really alive. He said you were, but I was never completely sure." I thought perhaps it was just a story, he told himself to make the pain bearable. Maggie moved forward on trembling legs, her cane tapping against the floor, and when she was close enough, she reached out with one shaking hand to touch Isabel's face, as if verifying that she was real and solid and not some cruel trick of imagination. "You have his eyes," Maggie said, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas's eyes. I would know them anywhere. You're his daughter. You're really his daughter." "I am," Isabel confirmed, her own tears flowing freely now. "And Sophie is his granddaughter, your great niece. We're family, all of us. We've always been family, even when we didn't know each other existed." The two women embraced awkwardly because of Isabel's seated position and Maggie's age, but with a fierce intensity that spoke to the weight of everything that had been lost and was now, impossibly, being found again. Marcus had hung back near the door, giving them space for this intimate reunion, but Sophie could see him watching with an expression that suggested he was grappling with his own complicated emotions. This was his grandfather's legacy too. The lives disrupted and the connections severed, and Sophie suspected he was beginning to understand the true cost of the ruthlessness that had built his family's fortune. After the initial rush of emotion had subsided, Maggie pulled a chair close to Isabel's and sat down, still holding the younger woman's hand as if afraid she might disappear if contact was broken. Sophie remained kneeling beside her mother, one hand on Isabel's knee, while Marcus quietly took a seat on the small sofa near the window, present but trying to make himself as unobtrusive as possible. The room felt charged with decades of unspoken truth, and Sophie could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the story she had been promised. "Tell me about Thomas," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. I've waited 50 years to know what happened to him, to understand why he vanished so completely that no investigator could ever find a trace." Isabel took a shaky breath, her eyes closing briefly as if gathering strength from some deep internal reserve. When she opened them again, they were clearer than Sophie had seen them in months, as if the importance of this moment had temporarily pushed back the fog of her disease. "My father was the strongest man I ever knew," Isabel began, "and also the most broken. When Maggie disappeared, when his sister vanished without a word or explanation, it destroyed something fundamental in him." She looked at Maggie with an expression that held no blame, only sadness. "He was 16 years old and suddenly alone in the world. The landlord wanted him out because he couldn't pay rent. His school friends drifted away because he became withdrawn and angry. He had nothing and no one, and he spiraled into a depression so deep that he nearly didn't survive it." Maggie made a sound of pure anguish, her free hand pressed to her mouth. "I didn't know. I should have come back sooner. I should have found a way to contact him, to let him know I was alive, that I hadn't abandoned him out of cruelty." "How could you have known?" Isabel said gently. "You were 19 and traumatized and alone in a foreign country. You were just trying to survive. My father understood that eventually. But in those first months, all he felt was the abandonment." She paused, her gaze growing distant as she retreated into memory. "He told me that what saved him was anger. He channeled all his grief and rage into investigating what had happened to Maggie, into finding out who was responsible for driving her away. He became obsessed with the story, with uncovering the truth about the American businessman who had humiliated his sister. Sophie felt her breath catch. He investigated Jonathan Caldwell. She glanced at Marcus, who had gone very still, his jaw tight with tension. Isabel nodded. He spent 6 months digging into Jonathan Caldwell's business dealings, his history, his patterns. Remember, this was 1972, before the internet, before easy access to information. Everything my father learned, he learned the hard way through old newspaper articles, through interviews with people who had worked for or against Caldwell, through piecing together fragments into a larger picture. And what he discovered, her voice dropped lower, is that Maggie was not the first person Jonathan Caldwell had deliberately humiliated and broken. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face pale. What do you mean? What did he find? Your grandfather had a pattern, Isabel said, looking directly at Marcus. Throughout his business career, whenever he encountered someone he perceived as beneath him but who had something he wanted, knowledge or skills or connections, he would engage in what my father called sport cruelty. He would create impossible challenges, make wagers he knew the other person would lose, and then use their failure and humiliation as leverage. Sometimes he would offer them buyouts after breaking their spirit, acquiring their work or their companies for a fraction of their worth. Other times he would simply destroy them for entertainment, for the pleasure of exercising his power over someone weaker. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the distant sounds of the care facility's daily operation. Sophie felt sick, understanding now that what had happened to Maggie was not an isolated incident of cruelty, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse enabled by wealth and power. My father documented everything, Isabel continued. He built a case, collected testimony from other victims, traced financial dealings that showed how Caldwell had built his empire partly on the backs of people he had deliberately destroyed, and he planned to publish it, to write an expose that would reveal Jonathan Caldwell for what he really was. But he never published it, Maggie said, her voice hollow. I searched for years for any article, any piece written by Thomas. There was nothing, because he was stopped, Isabel said flatly. In October of 1972, my father was approached by 2 men. They came to the small apartment where he was living, let themselves in with a key they shouldn't have had, and they sat him down and explained very calmly what would happen if he continued his investigation. They had photographs of him, documentation of everywhere he went, everyone he spoke to. They made it clear that they knew his movements better than he did himself, and then they told him about Maggie. Maggie's grip on Isabel's hand tightened. What about me? What did they say? They knew where you were, Isabel said gently. They knew you were in New York, knew where you were working, where you were living. They told my father that if he published his article, if he continued to be a problem, they would make sure you suffered the consequences. They would destroy your life the way Jonathan Caldwell had destroyed it once before, but this time there would be no escape, no second chance to build something new. They would ruin you completely and make sure my father knew he was responsible. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Jonathan Caldwell had weaponized Thomas's love for his sister, had turned the one thing that might have saved him from despair into the chain that bound him to silence. Sophie saw tears tracking down Marcus's face, and she realized he was crying. Quietly and without apparent awareness, his carefully constructed facade completely demolished by the weight of his family's sin. So he stopped, Maggie whispered. He let it go to protect me. Yes, Isabel confirmed. He burned all his research, every document and interview and photograph. He destroyed it all and he disappeared. He changed his name, moved to Canada, and started over with nothing. He worked construction jobs under the table, saved every penny, and eventually managed to get proper documentation under his new identity, Thomas Laurent. The irony of choosing my mother's maiden name, taking on the identity of someone from her family line, was not lost on it. He was erasing himself to keep you safe. But he didn't forget you, Sophie interjected, remembering her mother's earlier words. He told you about Maggie. He made sure you knew you had family even if you couldn't contact them. Isabel smiled, a sad but genuine expression. He told me stories about his sister from the time I was old enough to understand. He painted her as a hero, someone brave and beautiful who had survived terrible things. He never blamed her for leaving. He only blamed himself for not being strong enough to protect her, for not being enough reason for her to stay. I would have stayed if I had known how much he needed me, Maggie said, her voice breaking. I would have come back. I would have faced anything if I had understood what my running away did to him. But I was so ashamed, so convinced that I was worthless, that I thought he would be better off without me. She looked at Isabel with desperate intensity. Did he ever forgive me? Did he understand? He loved you until the day he died, Isabel said firmly. Never doubt that. Every choice he made, every sacrifice was because he loved you more than his own safety, more than his own dreams. She paused and fresh tears began to fall. He died 7 years ago. Cancer. It was quick in the end, which was a mercy. But before he died, he made me promise 2 things. First, that I would never try to find you. Never reach out, because he believed that the threat from Caldwell might still exist and he didn't want to put you in danger. And the second promise? Maggie asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. That I would tell Sophie about you when the time was right. That I would make sure she knew she came from a family that valued honor and courage, even when those values came at terrible cost. He wanted her to know that her grandfather was a good man who made hard choices to protect the people he loved. The weight of it all pressed down on Sophie like a physical force. Her father had been a man shaped by trauma and loss, who had given up his dreams and his identity to protect a sister who didn't even know she needed protecting. And her mother had carried the story alone for years, honoring a deathbed promise even as her own mind began to fail her. The sacrifice inherent in every choice they had made was staggering. Marcus spoke for the first time in long minutes, his voice rough with emotion. Is the threat still real? Are there still people connected to my grandfather who would hurt you, hurt any of you, if this story came to light? It was a practical question, and Sophie appreciated his attempt to focus on something actionable, something that could be addressed and potentially resolved. I don't know, Isabel admitted. My father believed the threat would persist, as long as the Caldwell family had power and reputation to protect. He thought that even after Jonathan died, the people who had worked for him, who had carried out his dirty work, would still have a vested interest in keeping his victims silent. But that was his fear talking, his trauma. I've never known if it was based on real ongoing danger or just the lasting echo of that one terrible encounter with those men. Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, his businessman's mind clearly engaged in problem-solving mode. I can find out. I have access to all of my grandfather's old files, his corporate records, his personal correspondence. If there's documentation of what he did, of who he used to do his dirty work, I can find it. And more importantly, I can find out if any of those people are still alive, still connected to the company, still in positions where they could pose a threat. Sophie watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Here was a man who had inherited enormous wealth and power, who had been taught to wield it without conscience or restraint, now using those same resources to unravel the rot at the foundation of his family's empire. It was a kind of redemption, though she suspected Marcus himself would argue that no amount of present goodness could balance the scales against past evil. Within minutes, he had made 3 phone calls, each one terse and commanding, mobilizing lawyers and archivists and investigators with the casual authority of someone who had never been told no. While Marcus worked, Maggie and Isabel talked in low voices, filling in the gaps of 50 years with the broad strokes that would take months or years to fully detail. Sophie sat quietly, listening to them piece together parallel lives, the choices made and the roads not taken, the moments where a different decision might have led them back to each other decades earlier. There was grief in their conversation, yes, but also a growing sense of wonder that despite everything, despite all the forces that had conspired to keep them apart, they had found each other in the end. My father used to say that the universe has a strange sense of timing, Isabel said at one point, her hand still clasped in Maggie's. He believed that things happened when they were meant to happen, not a moment before or after. I used to think that was just rationalization, a way to make peace with all the things he'd lost, but maybe he was right. Maybe this moment right now is exactly when we were meant to find each other. The practical part of Sophie's mind, the part that had learned to be cautious and skeptical growing up with limited resources, wanted to dismiss such thinking as magical reasoning. But another part of her, the part that had followed an inexplicable instinct to defend Maggie in the restaurant, that had felt an immediate and undeniable connection to this stranger, believed that perhaps there was something to it. Perhaps the universe did have its own logic, invisible to those caught up in the moment but clear in retrospect. Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression grim. I've got someone pulling the files now. Everything from the early 1970s, all correspondence, all security records, all financial transactions that might indicate payoffs or hired intimidation. It's going to take a few hours to compile and review everything. But if there's evidence of what happened to your father, he nodded at Isabel, we'll find it. And if there are still people connected to the company who were involved, I'll deal with them. How will you deal with them? Sophie asked, and she was surprised by the hardness in her own voice. What does dealing with them look like for someone like you? She didn't mean it as an insult, but there was an edge to the question, a challenge to Marcus to prove that he was truly different from his grandfather, that his power would be used to protect rather than to harm. Marcus met her gaze steadily. If they're still employed by Caldwell Innovations, they'll be fired immediately and exposed. If they're retired but collecting pensions or benefits from the company, those will be terminated. If they've committed crimes that can still be prosecuted, I'll turn every piece of evidence over to the authorities. His voice was cold, but beneath the ice, Sophie detected fury, righteous and intense. My grandfather may have thought he could buy loyalty and silence, but that currency is worthless now. Anyone who participated in terrorizing innocent people and destroying lives for corporate gain will face consequences. It won't bring back the years we lost, Maggie said quietly. It won't give Thomas his dreams back or undo the pain he carried, but it will mean that his sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. It will mean that someone finally chose justice over profit. She looked at Marcus with an expression that was almost maternal. Your grandfather would have destroyed you for this betrayal of the family's interests, you know? He would have seen your actions today as the ultimate disloyalty. Then I'm glad I never knew him, Marcus said simply. I'm glad all I inherited was his money and not his character. The money I can use to make things right. His character would have made me a monster. The starkness of his assessment hung in the air, and Sophie realized that this journey had cost Marcus something too. He had lost the comfortable narrative of his family's nobility, the story that had justified his own privilege and absolved him of responsibility for how that privilege was acquired. In its place was a harsher truth, but one that at least offered the possibility of authentic change. A nurse knocked softly on the door and entered, carrying Isabel's afternoon medications and a concerned expression. I don't want to interrupt, but Mrs. Laurent, you've been very stimulated today. Perhaps you should rest for a bit? The dementia care protocols were strict about routine and avoiding exhaustion that could trigger confusion or distress. Sophie started to stand, ready to usher everyone out, but Isabel shook her head firmly. I'm fine, Marie, better than fine. I'm having the most important conversation of my life, and I'm not stopping for pills and naps. The strength in her voice was remarkable, and Sophie saw the nurse's surprise at Isabel's unusual clarity and force of will. Maggie smiled, and Sophie saw in that smile an echo of what Isabel must have inherited from her father. That same stubborn determination that had allowed Thomas to survive loss and reinvention, that had carried him through decades of exile sustained only by love and the knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning. The nurse retreated diplomatically, leaving the medications on the bedside table with a reminder that Isabel should take them soon. The afternoon light had begun to slant lower through the window, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Marcus's phone buzzed repeatedly, and he stepped out into the hallway to take a call, his voice a low murmur through the partially open door. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sophie could see tension in his shoulders. The files are being compiled now, he reported. My head of legal affairs is reviewing everything personally, but there's already preliminary information. Two names keep appearing in the documents from 1972, Raymond Pierce and Victor Hawthorne. Raymond was my grandfather's younger brother, and Victor was head of corporate security. Both of them died years ago. Raymond in 1989, Victor in 2003. If they were the ones who threatened Thomas, they're beyond any earthly justice now. But were there others? Sophie pressed. Were they the only ones who knew what was happening, or was this part of a larger culture within the company? Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sophie saw the answer before he spoke it. There were others. From what we're seeing in the preliminary review, this kind of intimidation and silencing was standard operating procedure for dealing with what my grandfather called problem individuals. There are dozens of cases, maybe more, spread across decades. Some were paid off, some were threatened, some simply disappeared from the record entirely. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't just about Thomas and Maggie. It was about a systematic pattern of abuse that had affected countless lives, destroyed countless dreams, all in service of building and protecting an empire that cared nothing for the human cost of its success. Sophie felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous at the injustice of it, at the way wealth and power had been allowed to operate without accountability for so long. What are you going to do? Isabel asked Marcus. And there was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity about what this young man would choose when faced with the full truth of his inheritance. You could bury this information again. You could protect your company's reputation, your family's name. No one would ever know except us. And we're already complicit in keeping the secrets, just by virtue of having survived this long. I could, Marcus agreed. It would be the smart business decision. It would protect shareholder value and prevent legal liability. My board of directors would probably recommend exactly that course of action. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze finally settling on Sophie. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to bring in an independent ethics firm to conduct a full historical review of Caldwell Innovations. Every questionable action, every victim, every sin. And then I'm going to publish the findings and establish a compensation fund for anyone who was harmed by my grandfather's business practices. The board will fight you, Isabel warned. They'll say you're destroying the company, acting against the interests of the shareholder. Marcus smiled, and it was a hard, determined expression. I control 51% of the voting shares. The board can fight all they want, but they'll lose. And if exposing the truth damages the company's value, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. Some things are more important than money. Sophie felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the anger and bitterness she had been carrying since the previous night. Marcus Caldwell was not his grandfather. He had been shaped by that legacy, had absorbed its toxic lesson, but he was choosing now to break the pattern, to use his inheritance to heal rather than to harm. It didn't undo the past, didn't restore what had been lost, but it was something. It was a start. 3 months later, Sophie stood in the same dining room of Le Jardin d'Or where this extraordinary journey had begun, but everything was different now. The restaurant had become a meeting place for her newly expanded family, a location they had reclaimed and transformed from a site of intended humiliation into something that represented hope and connection. Maggie sat at what had become their regular table, the one by the window with the view of Central Park, and beside her sat Isabel, who had good days and bad days, but today was lucid and present and laughing at something Maggie had said about their childhood in Paris. Marcus had been true to his word in ways that had exceeded even Sophie's cautious optimism. The independent ethics review of Caldwell Innovations had been exhaustive and unflinching. documenting decades of corporate malfeasance and identifying 47 individuals who had been directly harmed by Jonathan Caldwell's business practices. The compensation fund Marcus established was substantial, funded by his personal fortune rather than company assets, and each victim or their descendants had been contacted and offered both financial restitution and a formal apology. The media coverage had been intense and not always favorable. Some praised Marcus for his courage and integrity. Others accused him of grandstanding or of destroying his grandfather's legacy out of some misguided sense of guilt. The company's stock had taken a hit, though it was slowly recovering as investors came to understand that ethical business practices might actually be good for long-term value. But the most profound change had been personal rather than corporate. Marcus had stepped down as CEO, appointing someone from outside the family to run the company, and had instead devoted himself to what he called restorative justice work. He spent his days meeting with the people his grandfather had harmed, listening to their stories, trying to understand the full scope of the damage that had been done. It was humbling work, often painful, and Sophie suspected it was the first time in Marcus's life that he had engaged with the world beyond the protective bubble of wealth and privilege. Pierre approached their table with the evening's menus, and Sophie noticed the way his demeanor toward her had changed. She was no longer just a waitress to him. She was someone connected to a story that had become legend in Manhattan's restaurant world, someone who had stood at the center of a moral reckoning that people were still talking about months later. He treated her now with a respect that felt both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable, as if she had become someone other than herself. "Will you be joining your family for dinner tonight, Mademoiselle Laurent?" Pierre asked, and the phrase "your family" sent a warm glow through Sophie's chest. "Yes," she said, untying her apron. "I'm officially off the clock." She slipped into the seat across from her mother and grandmother, and Marcus arrived moments later, slightly out of breath from rushing across town. "Sorry I'm late," he said, taking the remaining seat. "The meetings with the ethics board ran long. They're recommending additional changes to how we screen business partners and vendors, making sure we're not inadvertently doing business with other companies that engage in similar practices." He loosened his tie slightly and accepted the menu Pierre offered. "It's exhausting, but it's good." It feels like we're actually building something worth having. Maggie reached across the table and patted his hand affectionately. She had developed a grandmotherly fondness for Marcus that amused Sophie. The young man who had tried to humiliate Sophie in this very room had become someone Maggie considered part of their family, someone she worried about and encouraged, and occasionally gently scolded when he pushed himself too hard. "You're doing your grandfather proud," Maggie said, then corrected herself with a smile. "No, that's wrong. You're doing the opposite of what would have made him proud, and that's precisely what makes me proud of you." The dinner was long and leisurely, full of laughter and storytelling. Isabel had brought with her a box of items from Thomas's life, things she had kept all these years and was now sharing with Maggie. There were photographs of Thomas at various ages, his face maturing but his eyes remaining the same green that Sophie saw in the mirror every morning. There were notebooks filled with his writing, observations about the world, draft articles that had never been published, poems and fragments of stories. Maggie went through each item with reverent care, her fingers tracing her brother's handwriting, tears falling silently as she finally learned who he had become in all the years they had been apart. "He was so talented," Maggie whispered, reading one of his essays about immigrant workers in Montreal, about the dignity of labor and the injustice of systems that exploited the vulnerable. "He could have been a great journalist, could have changed the world with his words. Instead, he had to hide his light, bury his gifts, all because my presence in the world made him a target. He saved you," Isabel said firmly. "He chose to save you, and he never regretted that choice. You have to honor that. You have to accept that his love was greater than his ambition, and that wasn't a tragedy. It was a testament to what kind of man he was." The correction was gentle but important, and Sophie saw her grandmother wrestle with it, saw the lifelong guilt begin to shift into something more complicated, more accepting of the grace her brother had extended across the decades. As dessert was served, Sophie pulled out a folder she had been carrying. Inside was a collection of documents that represented weeks of work, phone calls and research and careful negotiation. "I have something for both of you," she said, distributing the papers between Maggie and her mother. "Marcus and I have been working on something, a project that we think honors Thomas's memory in the right way." The documents outlined the establishment of the Thomas Beaumont Foundation for Investigative Journalism, funded by Marcus's personal wealth and dedicated to supporting journalists who wanted to expose corporate wrongdoing and hold powerful interests accountable. The foundation would provide grants, legal support, and protection for reporters who faced intimidation or retaliation for their work. It would be everything Thomas had wanted to be, everything he had been prevented from becoming, made manifest for future generations. Maggie's hands trembled as she read through the papers, tears streaming down her face. This is extraordinary." You're giving him his voice back in a way. You're making sure that what happened to him, what he sacrificed, leads to something good. Marcus spoke up, his voice earnest. The foundation will also publish a comprehensive history of Jonathan Caldwell's business practices, written by independent journalists with full access to all the company's records. Your father's story, he nodded at Isabel, will be told as part of that history, not as a footnote or a shameful secret, but as a central example of one man's courage in the face of institutional corruption. Thomas Beaumont will be remembered as a hero, not as a victim. Isabel was crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth, overcome with emotion. My father would have been so humbled by this. He never saw himself as heroic. He just did what he thought was right, what love demanded. But to know that his story will help others, that his silence wasn't the end of things, but rather a seed that would eventually grow into something like this. She shook her head in wonder. Thank you, both of you. Thank you for giving meaning to our family's pain. The restaurant around them was full now, the dinner rush in full swing. And Sophie was aware of other diners glancing their way, recognizing them from the news coverage or from the stories that had circulated. She had become accustomed to the attention, had learned to accept that her life was no longer entirely private, but sitting here with her family, old and new and complicated. She felt a sense of peace that transcended the occasional awkwardness of public recognition. As they prepared to leave, Sophie noticed an elderly couple at a nearby table. The woman was berating their waitress about something trivial, her voice sharp and entitled, and Sophie saw the young server's face flush with embarrassment and suppressed anger. Without thinking, Sophie walked over to the table and addressed the woman directly. Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. The server here is doing her best to make your evening pleasant. Perhaps you could speak to her with the respect she deserves as a fellow human being. The woman looked affronted, sputtering about minding one's own business. But her husband placed a hand on her arm and spoke quietly. That's Sophie Laurent, dear, the girl from the Caldwell story. I think, she might know a thing or two about treating service workers with dignity. The recognition deflated the woman's outrage, and she mumbled something that might have been an apology to the server. The young waitress caught Sophie's eye and mouthed a grateful thank you, and Sophie smiled, understanding in a visceral way how one small act of standing up against cruelty could change everything. She had been that waitress 3 months ago, and now she was someone who could use her voice and her story to defend others in similar situations. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but had come to embrace. Outside the restaurant, the four of them stood on the sidewalk as Marcus's car pulled up. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the energy of the city that never slept. Maggie took Sophie's hand and Isabel's, linking the 3 generations together. We're family, she said simply, not because of genetics alone, but because we've chosen each other. Because we've fought to find each other against impossible odds. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Sophie looked at her grandmother, at her mother, at Marcus, who had somehow become essential to this strange new constellation of people she loved, and felt gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. A single sentence spoken in a moment of innocent observation had unlocked a mystery 50 years in the making. A cruel man's attempt at humiliation had instead become the catalyst for redemption and reunion, and a billionaire's grandma crying at the next table had turned out to be the missing piece that made sense of Sophie's entire. The world was full of pain and injustice, yes, but it was also full of unlikely connections and second chances. It was full of people who could choose, even after a lifetime of choosing wrong, to turn toward the light. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the truth that had been buried for decades would rise up like a phoenix from the ashes, transforming everyone it touched. Sophie Laurent had gone to work at Le Jardin d'Or expecting another ordinary night of serving the wealthy and invisible labor. Instead, she had found her family, her history, and a purpose that transcended the simple act of surviving. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to be silenced. Refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable, refuse to let the past dictate the future, and in learning that lesson she had helped 3 other people learn it too, creating ripples of change that would extend far beyond any of them could predict or measure. The story that had begun with mockery and tears had ended with justice and joy, and that was perhaps the greatest transformation of all.